I will spare the gentle reader the rigors of the facial emollients and tinctures necessary to effect this transformation, except to mention that as usual I have fixed a small birthmark to my temple, to draw attention away from the centre of my face. That is to say, my proboscis, the prominence of which was further diminished by my full, luxurious, and quite expensive, chestnut-coloured wig. But I cannot deny myself a description of the afternoon calling costume I wore that day. A heavenly confection of cerulean blue, dotted Swiss, gathered into scallops over a skirt of midnight blue, with a wide white satin belt, a blue bodice trimmed in white, a dainty blue hat topped with daisies and ribbons, and a blue and white parasol ruffled with dotted Swiss. In full gloves and gaiters I looked, if I do say it myself, rather a dream.
That excerpt you just heard was from the Enola Holmes book series. Basically, the way I was introduced to Enola Holmes was because I went to a sleepover and the Enola Holmes, the first movie, had just come out. So we all decided to watch it, and honestly, I enjoyed it a fair bit. It was quite fun. So then I decided to read the books, because of course. So basically the books are about Enola Holmes, and she's 14, and she is Sherlock Holmes' younger sister. And then when she's on her 14th birthday, actually her mother disappears, and her older brothers now have to take care of her. And Sherlock and Mycroft, they don't really want to have her come into their home, so they just decide to send her to a boarding school. But Enola doesn't really want that, you know, she wants to be free, so she runs away to London, and there she starts solving crimes of her own. And what I said earlier, the main character, right? The whole book is about Enola. So it would make sense for Enola to be a nice person, right? Or at least for me to like her, at least a little bit. And I didn't. I didn't like her at all. Enola Holmes is a brat, I'm sorry. The thing with these books is they're written in the first person perspective, which basically means we get to see all of Enola Holmes' thoughts. And they're just not very nice. Enola just spends all of the books thinking about how other people are more stupid than she is. I think in book 5 there's this part where she goes on this whole tirade about how handicapped people are really just lazy and want other people to take care of them. This isn't just something that's reserved for evil people, right? It's not like she's just rude to somebody who is trying to kill her. She's rude about everybody. Anybody who does not do what she wants them to do, or who doesn't help her out, is described as a toad-like hag, or a stunted slum-bred brat. Those are direct quotes. So that toad-like hag, that's Mrs. Culhane, and we meet her in the first book, and she actually saves Enola's life while endangering her own, right? But she has the misfortune of being ugly. So, of course, we're gonna be calling her a vulgar crone for the rest of the books. Honestly, Mrs. Culhane gets treated so badly in these books. For example, another point, Enola is talking to her, and then Enola has to pay her for something, I don't remember what. And Enola throws some money to her, and then this happens. Here, this is a quote. "It amused me, as I resumed my perch atop my cab, to glimpse Mrs. Culhane down on her hands and knees, hunting for the money as I drove away. Her greed was greater than her moral outrage, apparently." You threw the money on the ground. What else is she supposed to do? This is not her fault. This is not her fault. Honestly, justice for Mrs. Culhane, because you set her up to do this. You threw the money on the ground, and then when she stooped down to pick up the money, you were like, oh, haha, if you really were a moral person, you wouldn't pick it up, but apparently you're greedy. You could just give her the money, but okay. And then we don't hear from her again until, I think it's book 6, the last book, and then Enola finds out that a crime has been committed by an ugly woman. So obviously we're going to be investigating Mrs. Culhane, right? And the thing is that up till this point, Mrs. Culhane has done nothing but help Enola, right? So when Enola tells us that she knows Mrs. Culhane's ruthlessness and daring and the sort of friend she has, once again, quotes from the book, that doesn't make any sense. Because Enola doesn't know anything of the sort. All she knows is that this old woman has helped her. And of course then it turns out that Mrs. Culhane was the villain because she... Of course. And Enola even admits this in the book. She says, well, there's so many ugly old women in London, you know, it could have been any of them, but I decided to investigate one who was especially, I don't remember what it was, especially suspicious or something like that. And it's just like, no, she wasn't suspicious. You just thought she was ugly and therefore you didn't like her. And something else you may have realized is that that was not very good investigating, right? The entire plot hinges around the fact that Enola happens to know an ugly woman. And that's not very good. That's not a very good mystery. Of course, this could be forgiven if it happens in just one of the books, but that's not the case. This happens in every single book. Honestly, the biggest mystery in this series is how on earth Enola manages to be in the right place at the right time every single time. I'm serious, she keeps bumping into evidence, sometimes literally. It's really impressive, honestly. One time she happens to be standing outside of a window while people inside the room are talking about something, and that's how she figures it out under time. She hears some women gossiping, and then her subconscious tells her that a certain person is evil, and then that's how she figures out who the evil person is. All of the mysteries in these books are either very easy or so impossible that they don't make sense at all. In one book, the presence of asparagus in a hothouse is the clue that tells Enola where to find the missing Dr. Watson. I'm not even kidding, that's how it goes. She's like, oh, there's asparagus in this hothouse, and then she goes through this entire convoluted series of thoughts which include realizing that asparagus sounds like Spear of Gus, and that Gus is short for Augustus, and then that reminds her of something she saw earlier, and then that reminds her of the place where Dr. Watson is being held, and that's the series of events or thoughts that leads up to her solving the case. Cool. So if the mysteries are this easy, right, why has Sherlock Holmes, the great detective, why does he never figure them out? Well, that is because Sherlock Holmes in this book series, is not as smart as he is in the original series with just him in it. And this is true for a lot of the characters from the original Sherlock Holmes books. They have been strongly adapted to fit the author's view. Sherlock and Mycroft, for example, failed to see a lot of very obvious clues, and Enola says this is because they are sexist, right? She tells us that neither Sherlock nor Mycroft can imaginatively enter into the mind of a woman. And a lot of the time, Sherlock and Mycroft in these books dismiss clues because they're women things, right? So, for example, somebody gets a bouquet with very strange flowers in them. Flowers are for girls, I don't care. A woman is wearing strange clothing when she disappears. Well, you know how women are. It almost seems like the author hasn't read the same Sherlock Holmes books as I have. Because yes, Sherlock Holmes was sexist in the original books, he was. But he never let that get in the way of solving a mystery, right? He listened to everybody and noticed everybody. And he would never dismiss a clue that somebody gave him just because it was a woman saying it to him. That never happened in the books. The author really is trying to make Sherlock and Mycroft seem way more sexist in the Enola Holmes books than they really were as well. Because, for example, at one point she says that neither Sherlock nor Mycroft could abide being they could not abide a strong-minded woman who was in clear possession of her business. I think that was the quote or something like that. And that's funny because have you not read A Scandal in Bohemia? Irene Adler? That's a book where Sherlock not only imaginatively enters into the mind of a woman, but he also respects her all the more once he realizes that she is in fact in possession of her own business. So what books has this author been reading? She does often, well not often, a few times reference the Sherlock Holmes books, so I assume she's read them, because I recognize the quotes. But I don't think she got them. I don't think she understood them. My favorite character, Dr. Watson, you know, while Sherlock may have been sexist, Dr. Watson was not, okay? In the books, Sherlock at one point says that he thinks all women are untrustworthy or something like that. And then Watson tells us, the readers, that he finds this sentiment atrocious. And never at once in the books does Watson show any sexist behavior towards anybody at all. But for some reason in the Enola Holmes books, yes, he too now looks down on women. My man, no! According to the books, he looks upon any female with a natural distrust, and he refers to the feminist movement as the movement for women's so-called rights. What happened? why are you doing him like this? That's not necessary for you to bring a point across. The book can be feminist without turning my favorite character into a sexist, okay? It's not necessary. But I think the worst example of the author changing characters for her own narrative is one where it involves an actual, real historical person. I think that's the worst one of all of these, and that is Florence Nightingale in, I think, book 5. She was the invalid I mentioned earlier. So yeah, first, before we even meet the woman, Enola goes on this whole long rant about how, you know, invalids are just lazy. Cool. And then we meet Florence Nightingale, and then it turns out, according to this book, that Florence Nightingale is not actually handicapped. She can in fact walk, but she has stayed in her bed so she can get out of the social obligations that any woman faces in whatever society she's in, and so she can focus her time on more important stuff like politics. Okay. Now the author does say in the author's note, this is the only book, by the way, that has an author's note, the author does say and admit that she basically interpreted history the way she saw it, you know, so because we don't actually know, apparently, why Florence Nightingale was stuck in her bed for the rest of her life. And so the author basically decided, well, this is what I think and this is what I'm going to use for my story. But it's still a real historical character and you still use her for your agenda. And personally, I just don't really think that that's cool of you. I think that's kind of gross, honestly. So we may not know, you know, why Florence Nightingale was in her bed for the rest of her life. What we do know is that she was a Christian and that this motivated her to do the things she did. But I don't think the author of Enola Holmes knows this, or she ignored it, because this is what she has to say. But why, if she was born into a wealthy family, the sword to be presented at court, had she gone instead to a bloody cesspool of a hospital in the Crimea? Because she was Christian. This is a historical fact. But of course the author doesn't want to mention this, because the author, I haven't even mentioned her name yet, sorry, Nancy Springer, has an ideological message to share, and Christianity does not fit into this ideological message. Enola Holmes considers herself a freethinker and a rationalist, so no hocus pocus allowed. Except when in book 2 the entire plot hinges on hypnotism, and in book 6 when a gypsy reads her palm and it turns out to be true. But if we ignore those parts, then there's no magic and hocus pocus allowed. So yeah, Enola's big heroes are Malthus and Darwin. Interestingly, when she talks about cross-pollinating orchids, she does not mention the father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel. Maybe because he was a devout Catholic monk, but I wouldn't want to accuse the author, Nancy Springer, of, you know, leaving out Christian historical figures because she can't stand that some scientists were Christian. I would never accuse her of that. Anyway, what I did find interesting is in the second book where a character is writing in her diary, and for some reason she writes entire paragraphs, respect to her, because my hand just dies after writing a couple of words. But anyway, this character is musing on evolution, on the theory of evolution, and she is basically saying, well, what am I supposed to do with this knowledge? Because if I really believed in evolution, I would have to let all of the weak people I see around me die. It would be fine then if the theory of evolution was real, then I shouldn't be helping these poor people, because if the babies died, then it was because they were weaker, and that would be helping the theory of evolution, right? So this character actually delves quite deeply into, you know, the problems with the worldview, but this is only mentioned once, so we don't really do anything with it. Most of the time when we hear anything about evolution, it's, for example, Enola climbing a tree, and then she mentions that she's like one of Malthus's monkeys. So yeah, the books go deep one time, and then I don't know, then the author just leaves it at that. Another character in these books is Enola Holmes' mother, who, as I said, ran away on Enola's 14th birthday, because that's a cool thing to do. So basically, Enola's mother has run away to be with the gypsies. And by the way, the gypsies, what does it say? Yes, they worship her like a deity. completely normal thing to expect from an entire people group, but okay. The gypsies, have I got this in my notes? Blah, 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 blah. No, I haven't. Okay, so, this isn't in my notes, but the gypsies throughout these books are treated just like Mrs. Culhane, terribly. So, in the first book, Enola sees a band of gypsies, and then she mentions that her housekeeper would call them a dirty, thieving lot. Okay, and then instead of contradicting her, Enola is just like, well, yeah, I guess she's right, they are. I'm sorry. And then in another book, we see a gypsy woman in the... Oh, it's in the 6th book, where the gypsy woman reads her palm. But before the woman approaches her, Enola mentions to us, the audience, that gypsy women in the city were always beggars wheedling for money. Enola's mother is treated like a role model, and you see this in the movies as well, where she's treated as this big feminist, cool woman. But is she? Is she really? So let's just review, okay? She abandons Enola on her 14th birthday, which I mentioned. I've got a list here. She abandons Enola on her birthday. She never showed Enola any love, according to the books. Then in the last book, Enola receives a letter from her mother, in which her mother explains to Enola that it might be better for Enola to remain childless because of her personality. So she's just really out here being like, girl, you're like me, we're both terrible people to others, so yeah, don't have children, honey, bye. She also says the reason she left is because her role as a mother got in the way of her being a person. So she's really out here telling her daughter, hey, yeah, because your existence and the fact that I had to take care of you was kind of oppressing me, so I had to leave. Sorry. And what else? She also seems to believe that she owes nothing to her 2 sons, Sherlock and Mycroft. Why? Because she does not like them, I think, or something like that. And she also tells Enola that maybe her parenting wasn't so bad because it made Enola who she is. Ma'am, Enola is traumatized and has severe trust issues. You did that. And that's just a small selection of all the random nonsense that Enola's mother pulls in these books. Enola's mother also has very strong feminist ideals, and let me just real quick explain what I mean by feminist. I don't mean the belief that women and men are equal and should have equal rights. That's not what I mean. Basically, what by feminism in this book, it's mostly just women are better and the traditional, literally anything that's girly is bad and oppressive. That's basically the feminism in these books. So most of her feminism, also of Enola, shows itself in her abhorrence of corsets and skirts. At one point we're in the middle of a chase scene and Enola's having a hard time climbing over rooftops in her skirt, which, yeah, I get how you could have trouble doing that in a skirt. But then she stops. She doesn't stop running, I guess, but she takes time in the middle of the paragraph about a chase scene to tell us that she believes that skirts were made by men to stop women from doing fun stuff, and then we're just straight back to the action. I think this quote, which is, by the way, said by Florence Nightingale in the books, because, you know, of course, is a good summary of the attitudes throughout the book. The sufferings of an upper-class girl in a typical boarding school are only slightly less severe than those of an imprisoned criminal upon a treadmill. I speak of painful physical rigors that result invariably in deformity and sometimes in death. Do I need to remind you when this book is set? This book is set in the later part of the 19th century, the 1800s. This is the time when pretty much most of England was dirt poor, okay? And the books themselves don't shy away from this. We get lots of descriptions about old women with ringworms in their hair crawling in the mud. Don't worry, the books remind us time and time again that life is not good for pretty much everybody outside of Enola's class. This is the time of workhouses, okay? Where if you were too poor, you were forced to go into a workhouse, and then your children would be taken away from you and they would be made to work pretty much all day. You would be made to work all day, and then at the end of the day, you would get barely enough food to survive. If you were unlucky, or lucky depending on how you saw it, you would get some random sickness, and then you would die. But yeah, please tell me more about how going to a boarding school for rich young girls was almost as bad as that. I'm very, very interested in that. To be fair, one person did comment on my Goodreads review of these books that Enola and her mother might be part of the New Women movement, and what that basically was a movement that was quite radical, and it saw marriage, for example, it saw marriage as a form of prostitution, because you married a guy and went to bed with him, and then in return he gave you a home and clothing and food. And they also saw long skirts and corsets as oppressive. And this was a real movement. So, of course, Enola and their mother could be part of that movement. But the thing is, the books never really mention any of that. The books don't even really ever mention how Enola's views might be subjective. All of her horror stories are treated as fact. So personally, I think if you want to have such a radical feminist character, you should put an author's note at the end to explain that Enola's views are a bit much, you know? But it doesn't really matter anyway, because Enola Holmes in these books does not have to learn anything. Whenever she hurts her brother's feelings, it is because she would literally die if she would be made to conform to society's norms. So instead it's the men who have to learn to leave her alone. Speaking of which, the books basically end when Enola Holmes' brothers decide to leave her, a 15-year-old, alone to do her thing in London. And, you know, I would be fine with this if the world in which she lived was, you know, a softer, sweeter version of that time, because sometimes kids' books will do this, right? They'll take a time period and then they'll basically tone down the horrors of what could happen a lot. And in that case, it would be quite realistic for me to expect a 15-year-old to survive in London. But these books, they do not. They do not paint a nice picture of London, okay? We get treated, pretty much every book, to descriptions, like I said, of old ladies crawling in the mud with ringworms in their hair. Enola sees ladies of the night quite a lot, although she just tells us that she doesn't know what they are. Personally, I'm really wondering what the purpose is then of her mentioning it. Are the readers supposed to look up the term Lady of the Night? Okay, it's fine. We get treated to an extensive description of how rats ate a baby's face. Gross. In another book, a lady, her husband dies, and then the lady is so stressed that she gets a stillbirth, but then she's in the middle of a war, so people around her are going crazy from the trauma, so then a crazy person comes and takes her dead baby from her arms and just throws it into the sea. What? I had to put the book down after I read that. I'm not even kidding. I was reading that, and that was a lot. That was a lot. And I am 18, okay? Maybe we shouldn't be putting that in a book for 14-year-olds. Maybe it's a bit too much. So this is not a sweet and beautiful world where a young teen could easily survive, right? It's even mentioned in the books that Sherlock and Mycroft are definitely kind of afraid that Enola might be kidnapped and turned into a prostitute. This is mentioned. I don't believe that Enola, a 15-year-old, is going to survive. But it doesn't matter, because Enola, she's smart, you see. She can read entire pages at a glance, because she's always known how to read. And so now, when she sees a page of writing, she just has to look at it really quickly and she can read everything on it. Because that's definitely how that works. She's also capable of dragging around other people, carrying around adult people for considerable amounts of time, and as we mentioned earlier, she is more intelligent than everybody else, so she's gonna be fine, obviously. So yeah, that was very annoying, because we were really supposed to be siding with Enola, the 15-year-old, when her brothers were absolutely right the entire time, but that's okay. Okay, so those are all the big parts. There's some smaller parts of the books that I was a bit weirded out by. In book 2, somebody uses the phrase proud. I'm saying it softly because I think my mum is outside the door. Enola shows off her vocabulary at the expense of reading pleasure. Girl, nobody understands the word dolichocephalic. Just say you have a long head. Enola seems to pride herself in being different from all the other girls, and one way she does this is reminding us time and time again that she's ugly and that her hair looks like mud, and that she has a long head, and that she has a long nose and that she is pale and yeah, I don't care. Another thing is that Sherlock and Mycroft changed their opinions on women very quickly for people who apparently have been considered women as inferior their entire lives. It happens within a year. For me, that just begs the question, what was their mother doing? You know, because in the books it's mentioned that both Enola's mother and father were very forward-thinking and free-thinking and feminist and everything, right? And that's the reason that Enola is the way she is. So then why aren't her brothers the same, right? Because they live in the countryside, very remote, no outside influence. Were the parents just not there in the lives of their sons? Why is Enola one way and her brother so completely different? Is Enola the favorite child? Probably. Is it because she's a girl? So yeah, would I let my 14-year-old daughter read these books? No, I would not. You already knew this answer. For me, I think not only are there so many contrivances and nonsenses in these books that it's just annoying, but also I really wouldn't want to let my impressionable young daughter read these books where basically the entire world of history is portrayed as a nightmare for women, and men all suck, and women are so much better than men, and also if you manage to make yourself look pretty, women will treat you like trash, and men will treat you great. That's something that happens. Enola disguises herself as a beautiful young woman, and then all the men suddenly treat her amazingly, and all the women are jealous, and therefore they treat her badly. Yeah, okay, that's cool. We definitely act like that. Anyway. So, yeah, no, I wouldn't let my daughter read this because she's only gonna come away from these books thinking that men are shallow. And actually women are too. She's gonna come thinking away that apparently only a few girls out there, the ones who reject society's norms, that they're the only smart ones out there. And personally, I don't feel for that. So, yeah, I shall now be leaving you with this beautiful quote from Sherlock Holmes, the man himself, speaking absolute facts.
I have quite changed my mind, Enola, about your future. I pity any man who ever marries you. Indeed, I think perhaps you ought not to marry.